Imagine a small village in Eastern Europe, hundreds of years ago. The sun has disappeared. The streets are empty. Doors are locked. And inside one small house, a family sits in silence, listening to something outside. A strange sound, a knock, then another. The family believes the sound is coming from someone who should be dead, because according to the villagers, the dead were returning, not as ghosts, not as spirits, but as something much more terrifying. Vampires. For centuries, people across parts of Europe believed that certain dead people could rise from their graves, return to their villages, and attack the living. They believed these creatures could drain the life from their victims, and that once a vampire entered a family, death would follow. One person would become sick, then another, and eventually, the entire household could be affected. But here's the mystery. Why did people believe this? These weren't modern horror movies. These were real communities, real families, real graves.
Heave!
And
Push it harder!
sometimes, people
It gives
actually
way
opened
by the
those
saints.
graves because they were
What manner of
convinced the dead
sorcery is
person
this?
inside was still alive. In some cases, bodies were found with blood-like fluids around the mouth. Teeth appeared longer. Skin appeared to have moved. And the body sometimes looked strangely preserved. To people who didn't understand the science of decomposition, there was only one explanation. The dead had returned. But were these people really seeing vampires? Or was something else happening beneath the surface? Something caused by disease, fear, psychology, and the mysterious process of death itself. And perhaps the most disturbing question is this: what if the vampire legend wasn't created by storytellers, but by people who genuinely believed they had witnessed the impossible? To understand the vampire, we have to go back before Dracula, long before the castle, long before the cape, long before the legend we know today. Because the vampire may be much older than Dracula himself. And that's where our investigation begins. The vampire that existed before the vampire. Before Dracula. Before Transylvania became synonymous with vampires. Before there were other creatures, and they were far older. Across Eastern Europe, people told stories of the dead returning to the world of the living. But these creatures didn't always look like the vampires we know today. They had different names, different appearances, and different powers. In some traditions, the returning dead were believed to visit their families at night. They could cause illness, bring nightmares, drain a person's strength, or simply appear again and again, until someone in the household died. But why would people believe such stories? The answer may lie in something much darker than folklore: the grave itself. Hundreds of years ago, people didn't understand what happened to a human body after death. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't understand decomposition. They couldn't explain why a body could sometimes appear to move inside a coffin, or why blood-like fluids could emerge from the mouth and nose. They didn't understand why skin shrank, making hair and fingernails appear longer. And they certainly didn't understand why some bodies decomposed much slower than others. To a frightened village, these weren't natural processes. They were evidence. Evidence that the dead person wasn't truly dead. And sometimes, fear became so powerful that people took action. Graves were opened. Coffins were inspected. And suspected vampires were sometimes restrained or deliberately damaged to prevent them from returning. But there is another mystery. Why did similar stories appear across different regions? Was it simply coincidence? Were people copying the same legends? Or were communities witnessing similar unexplained events? and interpreting them in almost exactly the same way? The vampire wasn't born in a castle. It was born in the darkness surrounding death. And long before Dracula ever appeared on a printed page, Europe already had its own terrifying stories of the returning dead. But then, one historical figure would become permanently connected to the vampire legend. A prince, a warrior, and one of the most feared rulers of medieval Eastern Europe. His name was Vlad Dracula, and his real story may be even darker than the myth. Before Dracula became one of the most famous monsters in history, there was a real man whose name would become inseparable from the legend. His name was Vlad III. Born in the 15th century, Vlad ruled Wallachia, a region in what is now Romania. He lived in a brutal age. Wars were common. Political betrayal was everywhere. And rulers who appeared weak often didn't survive for long. Vlad understood that fear could be a weapon, and he used it. His enemies were punished with extraordinary brutality. His most infamous method of execution was impalement, wooden stakes, thousands of victims, and a reputation so terrifying that his enemies began calling him Vlad the Impaler. But here is where history becomes complicated. Was Vlad actually a blood-drinking monster? No reliable historical evidence shows that he was. The connection between Vlad and vampires came much later. His real name, however, contained something important. Dracula. His father, Vlad II, belonged to the Order of the Dragon, a military and political order. His title became associated with the word Dracul, and Vlad III became known as Dracula, often interpreted in the historical context as son of Dracul. But centuries later, the name Dracula would take on a completely different meaning. In the 19th century, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker was developing a new kind of monster, a mysterious aristocrat, a creature who lived at night, a being who survived by drinking blood. And when Stoker encountered the name Dracula, it gave his fictional vampire a powerful historical identity. But Stoker's Dracula was not simply Vlad III. The character was a mixture of folklore, Gothic fiction, Eastern European vampire traditions, and historical inspiration. The real Vlad had been a ruthless medieval ruler. The fictional Dracula became something else entirely, an immortal vampire. And this transformation created one of the most enduring mysteries in popular culture. How did a real 15th century prince become the world's most famous vampire? The answer takes us to a world of ancient folklore, sensational books, and a growing fascination with the supernatural. But before Dracula became immortal in fiction, Europe was already terrified of the dead who refused to stay dead. And that's where the story becomes even darker. By the 18th century, the vampire was no longer just a frightening village story. It was becoming a panic. Across parts of Eastern Europe, reports began spreading about people who had supposedly died, only to return. Families blamed mysterious deaths on the recently buried. Villagers began asking terrifying questions. Was the grave really the end? Or could the dead somehow continue to affect the living? In some communities, unexplained illness seemed to move from one household to another. A person would die. Then another family member would become sick. Then another. And when several deaths happened close together, people searched for an explanation. Sometimes, they found one in the graveyard. Villagers would dig up the recently deceased. They would open the coffin, and what they saw could be deeply disturbing. A body might appear surprisingly fresh. The skin could look intact. The abdomen could swell. Dark fluid could appear around the mouth and nose, and the hair and fingernails might appear longer. To modern eyes, these are recognizable signs of decomposition. But to people living centuries ago, They could look like evidence of something supernatural, a vampire, and sometimes the fear went even further. A suspected corpse might be staked, decapitated, burned, or buried with objects intended to prevent it from returning. These weren't scenes from a horror movie. They were attempts by frightened communities to protect themselves from what they believed was a genuine threat. And the panic didn't remain confined to isolated villages. Reports of vampires eventually reached educated Europeans, physicians, officials, writers, even governments. The subject became so serious that people began investigating it. In the early 18th century, reports from the Balkans described alleged vampire cases in remarkable detail. One of the most famous cases involved a Serbian man named Arnold Paoli. According to reports, Paul died, and villagers later claimed that he had returned from the grave. After several people died, officials investigated. The bodies were exhumed, and what they reportedly observed helped spread the vampire story across Europe. Newspapers and books began discussing the phenomenon. The vampire was no longer simply a superstition whispered around a village fire. It had become a subject of public fascination. But there was a problem. The more people investigated these cases, the more another possibility began to emerge. Perhaps the dead weren't returning at all. Perhaps the real mystery was what happens to a human body after death. And if that was true, then the vampire may never have been a monster hiding in the darkness. It may have been a misunderstanding, born from grief, disease, fear, and the unfamiliar science of decomposition. But one question remained. Why did so many people believe it so strongly? To answer that, we have to look inside the grave.